Good morning. This is the first of a series of Advent studies beginning with the Gospel of Matthew. The Church has always known that each of the Gospels has a different character. In the 2nd century, they were compared with the four creatures surrounding the throne in the book of Revelation. In these miniatures from the 15th century, we see Matthew carefully copying from the Old Testament, while John gets his inspiration directly from heaven. Luke includes more women in his Gospel than any of the other Gospels, and here we see his devotion to Mary. Today we're going to focus on Matthew's Gospel and his nativity story. It revolves around 5 Old Testament quotations concerning the virgin birth, Bethlehem, his birthplace, the slaughter of the children by Herod, the flight to Egypt, and the return to Nazareth, where he was brought up. The number 5 is most likely deliberate, as we see Jesus' teaching is grouped into 5 sermons and is the main structural feature of the Gospel. We can put this down to both personality and theology. Matthew likes order. For example, Luke has 56 names in his genealogy between Abraham and Jesus. But Matthew has organized it into 3 groups of 14 and makes a point of telling us. So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations, and from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations, and from the deportation to Babylon to the Messiah, 14 generations. So what is the significance of the number 14, you might ask? Well, it is the numerical value of the name David. In the ancient world, each letter was also assigned a number, and so everyone's name had a number. Now, this may seem rather far-fetched to us, but remember in the book of Revelation, where the readers are told that the number of the beast is 666. Most scholars believe this points to the name Nero Caesar. A central theme of Matthew's Gospel is that Jesus is the King of Israel. And in the nativity stories, the conflict is between King Herod, the usurper king, and Jesus, Israel's true king. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews?" This is probably why the Magi were soon turned into kings in Christian art. Isaiah 63, "Nations shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your dawn," was also influential in this regard. Returning to our 5 quotations and Jesus' teaching presented in 5 sermons, Matthew is pointing us to another Old Testament figure, namely Moses. Moses went up a mountain and came down with the law, which was written down in 5 books. Jesus goes up a mountain and delivers his teaching, which is written down in Matthew's Gospel in 5 sermons. Again, if you think this sounds a bit far-fetched, consider the content of the Sermon on the Mount. You have heard that it was said of those of ancient times, "You shall not murder." But I say to you, or you have heard that it was said, "Do not commit adultery." But I say to you, and so on with divorce, swearing oaths, eye for an eye, and love your neighbour and hate your enemy. There can be no doubt that Matthew is deliberately contrasting the teaching of Moses with the teaching of Jesus. All of which gives added gravity to the Great Commission at the end of the Gospel. We tend to focus on the first part, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit." But note what follows, "and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you." Of course, spreading the gospel is important, but so is passing on the teaching of Jesus. And none of the other Gospels emphasize this as much as Matthew. Matthew certainly believes that we are saved by faith, but he does not see this as in any way contrary to the importance of obeying Jesus' teaching. Now, returning to the Nativity story, I want to show you how Matthew not only quotes the Old Testament, but in doing so also transforms it. Micah 5:2 offers the promise, "But you, O Bethlehem of Ephratah, who are one of the little clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to rule in Israel." And of course, Matthew sees this as fulfilled in Jesus. But notice the way that he quotes it. "And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah." Ephratah is an ancient name that they probably wouldn't have understood. So he offers a more general description, "in the land of Judah." He is, after all, trying to communicate. But more significantly, instead of saying that Bethlehem is one of the smallest places, he says that it is by no means least among the rulers. His point, of course, is that now that Jesus has been born in Bethlehem, it will no longer be considered an insignificant little place. But the way he does this is by actually changing the wording of the quotation, which to us, living in a publishing world of printed books and copyrights, seems rather dubious. But to the ancients, it was a recognized form of interpretation. It was like saying, "I know you know what the original says, but I am suggesting that you now take it like this." A more subtle example is in the virgin birth story. As you know, Isaiah 7:14 says, "The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel." And of course, Matthew believes that this is referring to Mary and Jesus. But there is a problem, in that she doesn't call her baby Emmanuel. She calls him Jesus. So how can this text apply to him? Matthew's answer is simple but ingenious, and I wonder if you've ever noticed it before. Matthew's quotation reads, "The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel," which means God with us. Now, the "they" could refer to the plural Joseph and Mary, but since they don't call him Emmanuel either, most scholars think it refers to the later Christian community, who will come to understand this event as an incarnation, God coming amongst us. And this then works its way through the gospel. In Matthew 18:20, we read the familiar promise, "For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there among them." It is a promise I have often recalled when only 2 or 3 people have turned up to one of my meetings. Jesus promises his personal presence whenever 2 or 3 are gathered. What they made of that, we do not hear. Perhaps they took it metaphorically, like when we say, "I'll be with you in spirit." But it is further explored in the last verse of the book. "And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age." And so the gospel ends as it began, with the promise of Emmanuel, God with us, as we experience the presence of Jesus. Jesus is not just with us in spirit, in the sense of empathy. He is with us as the divine presence, Emmanuel, God with us.
O come, Emmanuel, to free your captive Israel, that mourns in lonely exile here, until the Son of God appear. Rejoice, rejoice, O to